Hey there, and welcome to my FlossTube. I'm Jean Farish, and I'm so glad that you're here with me today. I am going to concentrate on answering some of the many questions that have been left for me in comments. I've not been answering very many in the last couple of FlossTubes, and so I feel like I'm kind of behind. So let me get started with a really simple one. And this one came from a couple of different people, either comments on FlossTube or comments on the Jean Farish Needleworks Stitch Along page. And that is those who decide, for whatever reason, that Aida is the fabric for them. And I am just here to say that it's whatever is comfortable for you, that's the right fabric. Now, obviously, I demonstrate on linen all the time, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's the fabric I like to stitch on. The other is that most of the things that I do on linen can be done on Aida, and so I think it's pretty easy to apply what I'm showing you to the squares on Aida fabric. And when I am showing you something that can't be done on Aida, I'm trying to make that really clear and to tell you kind of the backstory as far as why it wouldn't work and give you alternatives whenever I can. So the bottom line is you need to stitch happy. You need to stitch on the fabric that is comfortable for you. So I hope that helps. I hope I'm going to say this name right. Vabi. She asked me if I could do a video on what is the right side of linen. And frankly, I don't need to do a video on this because there is no right or wrong side to linen. Linen is a plain weave. Weavers also refer to it as a tabby weave. And as the shuttle is going back and forth over, under, it's creating the same weave on both sides of the fabric. The entire fabric is going through the finishing process. So I just can't figure out how there could be a right or wrong side. With that said, if it's something that is altered in the post-manufacturing process. I didn't say that right. If it's altered in some way after it's been manufactured, either over-dyed or printed or whatever, then yeah, it could have a right or wrong side. But as far as when it leaves the linen manufacturer's operation, it doesn't have a right or wrong side. So that was an easy one. Let's see. Lots of questions about my segment on washing and ironing your cross stitch. This came from Jude. She wanted to know how long I left it in the bath, how long I left it in the soapy water. And she wanted to know if I was pushing it the whole time, and doesn't the iron flatten the stitches? And she also asked about using a wool mat underneath. So I don't let it soak unless it needs to be soaked. And this is a good opportunity for me to give you a little backstory about how I got introduced to Orvis Soap. This was mid-90s. I was in Des Moines, Iowa at one of the Spirit of Cross Stitch shows working on the next year's commemorative sampler. And because I always use my little sponge thing dampening my floss, and I also had a cardboard portfolio in my stitching bag. So sampler plus portfolio, plus I didn't put the cap on my dampening sponge tightly, equals disaster. So I had a spot at least as big as like a quarter, maybe a little bit bigger, of bright orange on my half-finished sampler. And I was just devastated. And one of the participants who also, you know, just lives the farm life said, let me introduce you to Orvis Soap. And she gave me a little, she lived locally, so she came back the next day with a little vial of Orvis Soap. and gave me instructions. And I basically, in the hotel room sink, filled it with water and Orvis every night and soaked it. And the next morning I would get up and rinse it and fill the basin with the Orvis and water again. And it took 4 or 5 days, but eventually that bright orange spot was gone, and I was sold as far as the effectiveness of Orvis soap for washing needlework. Later on, I learned what every 4-H kid in America knows about Orvis, and that is that it's the perfect thing for washing down a horse or other livestock. And it has other purposes as well. So I looked it up online, and this is what one of the suppliers has to say about Orvis. Orvis 52643 horse shampoo is a concentrated soap detergent in paste form that is soluble in hot or cold water and easily rinses out. Its non-irritating formula is effective in a wide range of cleaning tasks, including washing your horse, cleaning rugs, upholstery, and delicate fabrics. This horse shampoo works great on cattle, dogs, cats, and sheep as well. Keep your animals clean with this excellent horsehair shampoo. So I'm like, what? So this is how many people who live their life in the agriculture community, who also quilt and do needlework, kind of put all that together and said, hey, Orvis is great for washing quilts. It's great for washing needlework. So where to find it? Well, you can get a really big tub, it's like 7.5 pounds, as far as how it's sold from the company that makes it. And you can buy it in seed and feed stores. You can get it from a veterinarian, anybody who sells farm supplies. But I'm here to tell you that if you bought that 7.5 pound container, you would have enough for like a century of washing needlework. So this is what happens. Many people buy it in bulk and then they put it in smaller containers. The one that I showed in my video is an 8-ounce container. And I went back and looked, and I bought it 5 years ago. And I still have maybe a third of it left. So it will last a very long time. I literally put my finger into the jar and then put my hand under the water as it comes out of the faucet. And that's how little Orvis soap I use when I'm washing my typical piece of needlework. So one of the things you can do is buy a large container and some little containers and get together with all your friends and divvy it up and have a go at it. But you can get it from good needlework stores, quilt stores, as well as the big box stores. Although I'm here to tell you, whenever possible, support the little guy. Buy from your independent needlework shops. By supporting them, they can support you. Okay, so I answered part of Jude's question. So the rest of it, am I swishing it the entire time? No, not really. If it's, you can kind of tell if it's something that I've only been stitching on for a couple of weeks, then yeah, I just swish it around a little bit and take it out and rinse it. And as the description that I read to you says, it rinses out very, very easily. I never worry about leaving soap residue in my project. So I would say that all depends. Now, I have at times washed things that so desperately needed it, especially when I've reframed things that have been not been put under glass for years. The water's actually dingy when I wash it the first time, in which case I rinse it and maybe wash it a second time. And I'm gonna do that until the water's pretty much clear. Let's see, she also asked whether or not the iron, as I was ironing it, if it flattens out the stitches. Actually, the opposite happens. I really, really think that my stitches are plumper after I go through this process. But that is why I have the 4, 5, or 6 layers of terry towels underneath on top of my ironing board. So I've got my ironing board. I have 5 or 6 layers of terry towels. My needlework face down, has to be face down, and then iron it. And the terry towels will give and kind of accept the stitches so that they get flattened on the back, but not on the front. So, you know, that's what works for me. And this might be a good time to add a footnote here that these things that I'm describing to you are things that work for me. And you get to pick and choose. You get to say, huh, that makes sense, or I might try that, or that doesn't make sense to me at all. That's your role in all this. I am not here to tell you what to do. I am here to tell you what works for me. And if it helps you and you can put it into practice, then great. If not, we'll just move right on. Now the wool mat thing, that is something I know that quilters are using. 2 of my sisters are avid quilters, and I keep up with a lot of things that they are doing. And so I think it has some benefit to ironing things that you do want to have flat, but your needlework is not one of them. So I can't say it won't work. All I can say is that it doesn't sound like it will to me, and I haven't tried it. Also in that washing and ironing episode generated a question from Rhonda. She said, you used a plastic bin when washing. Do you use just that one for all your washing? Well, and I meant to explain that during that video segment. I live in a 3-generation household. I share this house with my daughter Elizabeth and my granddaughter Kelly. And our kitchen's a pretty active hub in our house, and I try very hard not to hog it. So there are a couple reasons for me to use that basin. One is, as I said, I'm sharing the sink, and if I do need to soak something, I want to be able to easily move it out of the way if somebody else comes along and needs to use the kitchen sink. Another reason is that where I lived previously, I did not have a white sink. It was stainless steel, and so I found it hard to determine if something bled or if the water appeared dirty or whatever. And so I started using the white basin just to give myself very clear feedback as far as what was happening with my embroidery. And so that's another reason for using it. The third reason is that prior to using the basin, I used to really scrub my kitchen sink because I didn't want any grease residue to get on my embroidery. Now, lest you think I'm a slob, we do clean out our kitchen sink, but before I'm going to put in something I have spent, 300 hours stitching, I want to make sure that I'm not doing any harm. So those are 3 good reasons why I use that white plastic basin. And yes, it is the only thing I use it for. And not so much because I ever said, I better just have this dedicated basin, as much as it is that I started using it and I haven't needed it for anything else. That said, I like the fact that Rhonda asked me that question because it makes me think, maybe that is a good idea. They're not that expensive. So to have one, especially if you do share your kitchen stuff with other family members who might decide they're going to soak an engine part or something in your basin, it might be a good idea to designate it and they say, okay, guys, this is for my embroidery. Don't use it for anything else. So I hope that helps. I got this question from Lynn. She mentioned that while I was ironing cotton floss on linen, and she wanted to know whether or not washing and ironing, if you're stitching with silk floss, whether or not the same process will work. So here's the answer that I gave her, and I told her, I said, this is really only half of an answer because I don't use a lot of silk. Don't have anything against it. I just never have. It is one of the things in my stitching repertoire that I need to spend more time doing so that I have more information to share with you. So but that's down the road. I have stitched quite a bit with a silk thread from the Karen collection called Water Lilies. Mainly I'm using it as an accent to a larger piece. I've never stitched an entire piece in silk. With that said, the one thing I do differently when I am ironing something that has silk in it is I alter the temperature of my iron so that it is compatible with ironing silk. Now, I hope I don't open up a whole controversy, argument, and stuff with people. Here is my understanding of silk. Silk in and of itself is highly washable. It gets wet during the manufacturing process. So it's not like something's going to happen to it when it gets wet. Many of the things that we buy, garments that we buy that say dry clean only, I think that label is on there because of the construction of the garment. It might be the interfacing. It might be the buttons. It may be their legal team saying, hey, save yourself some aggravation and tell people not to wash this. I have successfully washed silk blouses and ironed them accordingly. And, but that's me. So I'm not advocating it. I'm not saying, you know, the next time you have a silk blouse, instead of taking it to the dry cleaner, wash it, and then if it gets ruined, blame Jean. We're not going there. So I did a little bit of research after giving Lynn this answer. And from experts in the field, you get two very, very different answers. Some people are adamant that it cannot be washed, and others are saying, yeah, it can be. And right now I'm trusting that, yeah, it can be. Maybe that's because I'm just here to say, if I can't wash it, I'm not going to use it in my counter cross stitch. Again, we're not talking about gold work or many of the other types of embroidery, but we're talking about mainstream cross stitch. If I can't wash it, I'm not going to use it, but that's me. So what I do if I'm not sure about something, is I'm going to pre-wash it. And I need to do an episode. I need to give that idea more time, but that's not going to be today. That'll have to be at a future time. Although I do have a brief article on jeanfarishneedleworks.com. One of my blog posts is about this idea of pre-washing floss. This is probably a good time to interject a little bit of terminology about the dye process. Dyers are familiar with a term called crocking. And crocking is the simplest way I can think of to explain this is, imagine when you're dyeing something and the molecules in the dye don't adhere to what you want it to. It's just sort of lays there, maybe sort of, you know, half connected, half not connected. And then you bring it home and you're stitching with it and you go to wash it, and those little molecules say, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to find someplace else to go. That's a temporary situation. That is not, you have not ruined your needlework when that happens. If you just keep washing it and rinsing it and not letting it dry, and certainly not ironing it, don't add heat to it, you can pretty much get those loose molecules out of your needlework. One of the things that happens is that needleworkers kind of panic. They see that the color is bleeding and they're like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Let me get it out of the water. Let me dry it. Let me iron it. No, just keep it wet. and keep rinsing it. See, because the thing, this is what I know about silk. Silk is one of the strongest fibers in the world. When it's wet, it is one of the weaker ones. So you do need to be careful with it while it's wet. But once it's dry, silk is incredibly strong and durable. So what is my advice about washing silks? First of all, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, because I am not an expert on this. I do suggest that you pre-wash the silk if you have any question about it whatsoever, and definitely iron it on the silk setting. So that's why I'm saying I'm giving you a half of an answer, because until I have hours and hours and hours of experience stitching with and washing and ironing silk, I am not going to tell you how to do it. I'm going to tell you what I would do, but I'm not going to tell you what you should do. In a similar topic, Crafty Librarian said, I have started and am well into the stitching of a project using over-dyed floss on a medium blue Zweigart even weave. I did not pre-wash the floss to make it color fast. Do I still have the option of washing this project? And if so, how should I wash it to prevent colors from running? And what I told her was that what I would do is, at this point, is to test each one of the colors separately. And if they pass the color fastness test, then hey, you're good to go. If one or more of them doesn't, then I would treat them separately. And then I would probably use a color catcher when I was washing. Now, in trying to do a little bit of hands-on research with this idea, my daughter Elizabeth had finished a project using all over dyes, and she had not tested them. You know how it is. Kids don't listen to their parents. So first of all, we pulled out the darkest colors from her supply that were in that project and tested them. And we washed it with color catchers. So we did both of those things. Now the testing is very simple. I would, again, in a small basin, or because you're not going to need very much, even just a small bowl, just a drop or two of the Orvis soap or whatever you plan on using in cool water. And I would take the floss and swish it around and then lay it on white paper towels and fold it in half. And if no dye comes off on the paper towel, then I think you're good to go. If dye does come off of it, then that's again a whole nother story, and it deserves its own little episode. I do deal with it a little bit in that article on my blog. So that's what I would do. That's what I advise Crafty Librarian to do, and maybe that will help you. The other thing too to do, if you want to take the time, if you have colors that are really questionable, take a scrap of fabric and stitch with it, and then put it through the wash process and see. But here's another thing too. There are several things that can cause two stitchers who have used the identical products, and one of them has a issue with color fastness and the other one doesn't. One of them is what you're washing it with. And this is again why I just, I feel 100% safe and confident with Orvis. You may have something else that you feel safe and confident with. I will say that there are products out there, for example, that might be made for washing wool, which is not necessarily good for washing cotton and flax, which is basically what linen is, and may not be good for washing silk. So do be aware that there are some things that are perfectly good for one type of fiber, that's a disaster for these other types of fibers. So that's one factor, is what type of soap are you using? The other thing is what's in your water. Because the person who lives 800 miles away, or even 8 miles down the road, but they're on well water and I'm on city water, can end up with different results. You know, it all goes back to chemistry. You know, you change one thing in an experiment and the outcome can be different. The outcome's probably going to be different. The question is, how different? So just be aware that there are many factors that will impact whether or not you have a color disaster on your hands. Now, red floss gets a bad rap among needle workers. About, I don't know, it's been a while now, I did an experiment and I stitched with red floss, DMC red floss, the brightest color. I think it probably used 304, one of the really, really bright reds, Christmas red. And I stitched about 10 different samples, just, 8 or 10 stitches on each of 10 different pieces of white fabric. The first one I washed in cool water, and I kept increasing the temperature until the last one was washed in hot water. The cool water, the tepid water, no problem. The hot water, it bled. So is that the floss? Is that the fault of the floss? Can we say, well, stitching with red floss is iffy? I would never wash red floss because somebody washed it in hot water and it bled? Or maybe it had to do with the water that they were washing it in, or the soap that they used. So I don't know. I'm just going to tell you that in all my years, I've never had DMC bleed any color. I've never had Cosmo bleed any color. That's my experience. Erlene asked a question that frankly a lot of people have asked, and that's about what size needle to use with what size fabric. And I know that somewhere out there are lists of people saying, well, in this count fabric, use this, etc. Here are the two things that you have to know whether or not you have the right size needle. The first one is, whatever you're stitching with, can you thread it in the eye of the needle? And if the answer to that question is yes, then that's half your answer. The next part of the question is, does the needle glide easily through the fabric without dislodging it? And if the answer to that is yes, then you've got the right size needle. So there's a range. For example, when I'm stitching on anything from 28 to 32 count linen, which is generally my range, then I am using either a 26 or 28 needle. So that's where I am. Might use a little larger needle when I'm doing pull thread work, because the linen thread I'm stitching with is a little bit more difficult to thread in the eye of a tapestry needle than floss would be. And the idea of choosing a needle size that doesn't dislodge my linen fabric doesn't apply, because I am trying to dislodge it. I'm going to be pulling the threads to pull them together. Now I know that there's a school of thought out there that you see more among needle pointers than you do cross stitchers, although I'm beginning to see it edge into the cross stitch world also, that goes something like this. You want a needle that's big enough that it will push your fabric threads apart, so that as you're pulling your needle through, the thread doesn't touch the fabric, so that it's so it doesn't get abraded as you're pulling it through. I'm sorry, that just doesn't make sense to me, because when I push my needle through and push these two apart, then over here, these two are now closer together. I don't know. It just, first of all, if you stitch with a piece of floss that's 15, 16, 17 inches long, you're not going to destroy it while you're stitching. So we're talking, that's about 40 or 45 stitches of just regular size cross stitch. And again, that's what I'm talking about, is cross stitch. I'm not applying this to other types of needlework where that little urban tail works for, but doesn't work for me. Okay, what's next? Question about JoJo, and this is reference to the segment about stitching with over dyes or variegated floss and using a thread drop to store my threads. I understood about pulling the entire 6 strands and putting 2 together the same way so colors match, but what about when it's time to rethread? Do you pull the next 2 from the same group you pulled from and continue as before? And if yes, wouldn't that mess up the next section, making it exactly the same as what you just used? And if you cut the floss and put it in the thread drop, wouldn't you not know which group of threads should be used next? So in effect, I could pull a section that was close to the same color as I last used. So, okay, this is an excellent question. Let me see if I can respond in a way that will make sense. Actually, what I should do is grab my thread drop to show you. Where did I put that? These are really, really, really good questions. So I should pack up and say that if you want to kind of manipulate the colors, then you don't want to pre-cut them as I normally do and put them on my thread drops. You may want to look at the range of colors and say, okay, this is the section I want, this is the section I want. And a good example of that is, here's a piece that's counted needlepoint. It's actually counted needlepoint on a painted canvas, but the pair is done with Cairn Collection Water Lilies, which is a silk thread. And I wanted, and the range of colors goes from like an apricot color to a pear green. And I needed to pick the strands that gave me that color range. And without going into a whole lot of complicated things about the way I taught this, it was important not to pre-cut the strands because you could have cut it like in the middle of the apricot color. So I instructed my students, okay, find the piece that goes from the apricot to the green and cut that segment. So that's a whole nother way of dealing with variegateds. So back to the question of what do you do when you have put your overdyed or variegated onto thread drops or bobbins or whatever. How do you deal with it? So let's take a look at what I do with thread drops. This is the variegated I'm going to be using for the quote on When Hearts Come Home at Christmas. And so this is this is pre-cut, and each cut is right at 30 inches. So what I'm going to do is loosen this whole thing up, and I'm just going to take out one piece that's all 6 strands still together. Okay, so here's the 30-inch length. This is the whole thing, and because I'm going to be stitching with 2 strands, then this is really too long. So grab my scissors somewhere and cut it in half. So now I've got my 15-inch length that I plan on stitching with. So let's take a look at these. Now both of these are pretty pale. They're pretty much the pale pink at one end. So obviously I cut it in the middle of that color segment. But then they get very different towards the other end. So what JoJo is asking about, I'm pretty sure here, if I understand her right, is if I'm doing a long line of stitching, or like when I'm start to do the quote, if I start with stitching with this dark pink and work to this end, then the next segment in that row or that group of words, ideally I'll start with this end of the other one so that I'm getting the full range of the variegation. So how do I keep them straight? Well, first of all, let me say I live in a household that has a dog but no cats. So I think that that's one of the things that makes it easy, because Oliver pretty much doesn't pay any attention to my stitching. He doesn't pay any attention to me at all. I'm like number 3 in the rank of his people in our household. So what I would do, and what I will be doing soon on that stitch along, is I would take out my 2 strands from this and, you know, lay them side by side so that I have them together. Now, what I could do at this point is I could separate this entirely. Okay, so let's say for a moment I'm not going to stitch with this one right away, and I could just put like a little knot like that and just set it aside, and then do the same thing with this. Pull one out, pull the other one out, and so that's another pair that's identical to that first one. And set that one aside. And then if I started stitching with this one, when I got, let's say if my first stitches were the darkest color, when I got to the light pink and I'm ready to start another strand, I would go on with this one. And I would thread my needle so that I'm starting with the light end and going toward the darker end. And that part is sort of counterintuitive. It's like you need to thread your needle with the end that you don't want your first stitches to be. So the part of the variegation that you want, that you've designated, okay, this is going to be my first stitches, that needs to be the tail end. The part that goes to the eye of your needle will be the last stitches that you take. So that's kind of, like I say, it's sort of counterintuitive. So that's what I would do. Now, the reason I mentioned not having a cat is that if I'm sitting down and I'm going to have a fairly long, hoping to have a fairly long stitching session, I can just kind of lay these out on the arm of the chair or whatever, and say, okay, you kind of have an A and a B. You know, I have A, B, A, B, and that's how I would do it. So I hope that makes sense. That's kind of a long answer. Okay, let's see next. Oh, this was also a thread drop related question. Kathy asked, or she said, I love learning about thread drops. Yay, Kathy. And pulling the one thread out, which that's just like the best part of thread drops. I've been putting my DMC on bobbins, but I think this way might be better. However, after finishing a project, what is your storage? Do you keep them hanging somehow or store in plastic bags? So this ring has all the colors on it for the project When Hearts Come Home at Christmas. And I'll leave them on the project ring until I'm done stitching. Then I take this apart and I have all the 100s on one ring, all the 200s on another ring, the 300s on another ring, etc. And so that's where they go to stay until I need them again. So now I have a fairly big project ring, like a 2 or 3 inch ring with all of, like I say, one set of numbers, you know, anything from 100 to 199, for example. And then I take those rings and I hang them on this thing that I've had since forever. I'm pretty sure it was sold to hold belts or scarves or something, but it has a hanger to put in my closet, and then it has these little prongs that come out, and I put the rings on there, and then I put the whole thing in my closet. And you know, what I like about that is a fairly cheap storage system. It's pretty much going to be dust free and sunlight free in my closet. Can't promise about the dust free, I guess, but you know, it's a fairly safe place to store it. Most textile experts and conservationists, the people who I follow and read their blogs, they are adamant about not storing any kind of textiles in plastic. So I feel pretty confident about my storage system, since it's not really stored in anything. It's just, you know, kind of hanging there. Yeah, but and again, let me say, I don't, you know, I live in a fairly temperate climate. We don't have, it's not super dry, it's not super moist. And all these things might have an impact on what's going to work for you. So again, this is what works for me. Sandra left me a really, really good question. Well, I've had all these really good questions, but this one really spoke to me because it actually was something that recently happened to me. She said, I stitched a red band sampler earlier in the year using DMC 304, and it left a red mark on the fabric in an area that I had stitched incorrectly and had to restitch 2 threads to the left. Okay, so that red marking is probably that crocking I was talking about earlier. But it's also that there's a possibility that your stitches are just leaving a little bit of fuzz or whatever. So a couple of things that I did that might work for Sandra and for others who encounter this. And it's not always red. It could be black, it could be dark blue or whatever. Anything that leaves sort of a shadow. The stitches are gone, but you can still kind of tell where the color was. Scotch tape, sticky tape of any sort, that you can just kind of put the sticky side down and, you know, pull it away. Like you might try to get lint off of a black coat or something. But this is also one of the things that I find is using an eraser, but a white eraser, not the pink kind that we're used to that's on the end of a, you know, your typical pencil that you might remember from school, from your school days. But a white eraser, literally rubbing over the area, will also take some of it away. And I also have a toothbrush that I don't use for anything other than my needlework that I kind of brush over it. Now, keeping in mind that I also wash all of my needlework when I'm done, if there is any residue left, then that final washing kind of takes it out. But that worked for me just recently when I had to rip out some stitches, and like I say, it's just a faint little shadow that gets left behind. So, but whether it's crocking or whether it's the little fuzzes that are left behind from the stitching, neither of those things are permanent, and neither of those things should be a disaster. They're both fixable. So. Those were some really great questions, and there are actually still more here on my desk that we just don't really have time to get to today. And I hope that you will keep asking these questions. Not only does it let me know what's on your mind, but it also tells me that as a group of stitchers, you are curious, you are questioning what best practices are, and you're asking yourself what works for you. And I applaud that type of thinking. So I hope that you'll keep asking these questions and letting me know what's on your mind. So between now and when we get together again next week, I hope that you will stitch happy and stay safe.